The Yeti in the Siberian forest. It was the winter of 1950. I was just a boy then, no older than 12. But I'll never forget what happened that year. What we saw, the grown men, the hunters, they still don't talk about it much. When they do, their eyes shift around, and they speak in hushed tones, like the words might summon something from the woods, something none of them ever truly understood. They always call it a beast, a thing. But I know better now. It was something far worse, something more terrifying than anything my father, or the men with him, could have ever imagined. And I'm not sure I want to understand it fully. We lived deep in the heart of Siberia, in a small village perched at the edge of a dense, snow-covered forest. The winters were harsh, and the nights, endless. The trees, tall and thick, with snow weighing down their branches, seemed like endless sentinels watching us, quiet, unmoving, and cold. The kind of place where, when the wind howled through the pines, you could swear the forest was alive, whispering secrets that no human ear should ever hear. I remember the day it all began. My father, Ivan, and his friends Victor, Anatoly, and Jaeger were preparing for a hunting trip. The four of them were seasoned hunters, veterans of the harshest winter Siberia could throw at them. They had tracked wolves, bears, and even lynx through those woods. But that year was different. They left early, just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the jagged horizon. The village was still asleep, the streets coated in a thick blanket of snow. It was the kind of quiet morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. I watched them pack their sleds and guns, their faces hard with determination. They had no idea what awaited them. None of us did. By noon, the temperature had dropped so low that even the thickest fur would do little to protect you from the cold. The men disappeared into the trees, and I stayed behind, helping my mother with chores, though I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything until they returned. The hours dragged on, and by late afternoon, the wind started to pick up, turning the snow into a thick, swirling mist. We could no longer hear the distant calls of the hunters. The quiet was absolute. And then, in the evening, they came back. At first, I thought it was just the wind howling through the trees. But when they stumbled into the house, their faces pale and taut with fear, I knew something was wrong. My father was the first to speak, his voice tight with a kind of urgency I had never heard before. "We saw something," he said, his eyes darting nervously to the window. "Something in the woods." We were not alone. I thought he was just tired, maybe even a little delirious from the cold. But Victor, the oldest of the group, stepped forward and nodded. "It was no bear, no wolf," he said, his voice trembling. It was huge, covered in white fur, standing between the trees like a man. But not a man. It was something else. They told us they had been tracking a deer, something that had been elusive for days. But when they got closer to their target, they noticed something strange. Presence. Something standing among the trees, watching them. Jaeger described it as a giant at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted white fur, and its eyes, those eyes, they glowed with a cold, predatory fire. Victor said it was like it was studying them, calculating their every move, like it had been waiting for them. At first, they thought it was just some trick of the light, maybe a bear or an elk standing still in the snow. But then it moved. It didn't walk like any animal they knew. It moved like a man, with a deliberate, slow pace, stepping forward with unnatural grace for something so large. When they tried to approach it, the creature let out a roar. No, not a roar, more like a scream, a sound so loud and deep that it shook the very earth beneath their feet. It was a sound that echoed through the trees, a vibration that rattled their bones. The ground itself seemed to tremble, and for a moment, they couldn't move. Fear gripped them, and all they could do was stare as the thing retreated deeper into the woods. "We tried to follow," my father said, his face ashen. "But it left tracks, not like anything I've ever seen before. Giant footprints, huge, deep in the snow. We didn't follow, Victor added quickly. We left. We ran. They didn't speak about it much after that. In the weeks that followed, the men would occasionally exchange a glance or a nervous laugh. But the subject was always quickly dropped. But I could see it in their eyes, whatever it was they'd encountered in the forest. It had shaken them to their core. The worst part came the next day, when they decided to return to the area to see if they could find any trace of the creature. They took their sleds again, leaving in the early morning. But this time, they were on edge, watching the trees carefully, as if expecting the thing to emerge at any moment. I stayed behind. My mother insisted that I not go with them, though I could see the worry on her face. She, too, knew something wasn't right. By the time they returned, the temperature had dropped even further, and the sky had turned a deep, sickly shade of purple. The men's faces were white with fear, their eyes wide and wild, and when they spoke, their voices were hushed, as if afraid the thing might be listening. There were footprints, my father said, almost in disbelief. The tracks were still there, deep in the snow, leading into the forest. But this time, we found something else. What? I asked, my heart pounding. A skull, Victor said quietly. A human skull, half buried in the snow. They didn't tell me everything, but from the look in my father's eyes, I knew it was bad. The tracks had led deeper into the woods, further than they had ever gone before. They had followed the tracks until they reached a clearing. And there, in the center of the clearing, they found the skull, a large, weathered thing, cracked and aged with time. But the worst part? There were scratches on it. Long, deep gouges that could only have come from something with claws, something far too big for a man. They left, fast, and they didn't speak of it again for many years. But I know what happened. I know what they saw out there in the forest. And I know what still waits in the Siberian wilderness, hidden among the trees. Because when I asked my father what happened to the creature, he looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. It's still out there, he said softly. And it's not alone. There are whispers among the villagers now, of strange figures seen lurking in the woods, of shadows that move when no one's looking, and sometimes, when the wind picks up and the snow falls heavy, I can't help but feel a chill, a presence in the trees just beyond the edge of the village. I don't know what it was. I don't know what the creature was that my father and his friends encountered that night. Maybe it was something they couldn't explain. Maybe it was something old, something that shouldn't exist. But I know one thing for sure. The Yeti of Siberia is real, and it's still out there, waiting in the cold, silent woods. Story number 2. The Yeti of the Himalayas. It was the winter of 1972 when I first heard the legend of the Yeti. I was young, barely in my 20s, and desperate to make a name for myself. I joined a group of mountaineers and adventurers eager to conquer the unforgiving peaks of the Himalayas, a region steeped in mystery, silence, and, according to some, a terrifying myth. They said something prowled the snow-covered mountains, something huge, something that had eluded every explorer who ever dared to track it. They called it the Yeti. I didn't believe in legends. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. And I certainly didn't believe in things that couldn't be explained by reason and science. But after what happened, after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. The climb was treacherous. The wind howled like a beast, biting at our skin, numbing our fingers and toes. The higher we went, the more oppressive the silence became. Nothing lived up here, nothing except the wind and the snow. Our tents were pitched at the edge of the base camp, the vast emptiness of the mountains stretching out before us. There was no noise, just the whisper of snowflakes settling on the ground, the occasional crunch of ice beneath our boots, and the beat of our hearts. The expedition wasn't just about summiting the peak. It was about searching for the unknown, for the creatures and phenomena that had remained hidden for centuries. We had all heard the stories. The locals spoke of large, hairy creatures with glowing eyes, of shadows that moved unnaturally in the snow, of footprints that could span 2 feet in length. Most of us dismissed it as superstition. But one of the men in the group, a seasoned explorer named Richard, was obsessed with finding proof. He was determined to uncover the truth behind the Yeti. On the 5th night, everything changed. We had set up camp just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature plummeted rapidly, and a biting wind began to whip across the camp. Richard and the others were discussing the best route to take the next day. But I was already inside my tent, trying to find some warmth in the stiff air. I was half asleep when I first heard it. At first, it was just a soft sound, barely noticeable over the howling wind. I thought it was the snow shifting beneath our tents, or perhaps the creaking of the ice. But then came again a deep, rhythmic thudding, like the sound of a heavy footfall pressing into the snow. My heart began to pound as I sat up, straining to hear over the wind. The noise continued, growing louder, closer. I heard someone's breath catch in the cold air, and then a voice whispered through the tense fabric. "Do you hear that?" It was Richard, and his voice was laced with fear. I wasn't the only one who heard it now. The thudding steps came closer, too close for comfort. The snow outside crunched underfoot with a heavy force, each step deliberate, almost too heavy to belong to any man. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling with the realization that something was moving outside. The group was silent now, holding their breath as we listened to the steps approach. Richard's voice came again, more urgent this time. "Look through the slit in your tent. Quickly." I crawled over to the side of the tent and pressed my eye against the small opening. My breath fogged up the fabric, but I could still make out the outline of a figure massive, hulking, standing just outside our camp. At first, I thought it was one of the guides. But no, this was different. This wasn't a man. What I saw outside the tent was enormous, standing nearly 8 feet tall. It was covered in thick, matted white fur, and the shape of its body was hunched, like an animal, but far too tall to be anything human. It stood in the snow, motionless, just beyond the light of our campfire, as though it was studying us. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The creature stood still for what felt like an eternity, and I wondered if it had sensed our presence. Was it watching us? Waiting? I tried to pull my head away from the slit in the tent, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The creature's eyes glowed, a cold, eerie light that flickered like the reflection of ice. And then, it did something that made my blood run cold. Turned its head, slowly, very slowly, and I swear, for a brief moment, it looked directly at me. My stomach lurched. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. Richard's voice broke the silence. "Now! Flash the light!" I reached for the flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it straight at the creature outside. The beam of light sliced through the darkness like a blade. And in that moment, the creature turned and bolted, moving faster than any animal of that size had a right to. The snow crunched loudly beneath its feet as it disappeared into the night. And for a long time, we just sat there in silence, unable to process what had just happened. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of it. Had we just seen a Yeti? A creature of legend? Something thought to be no more than an ancient myth? But then, something else happened. Something that I'll never forget. When the group slowly gathered outside, the flashlight beam illuminated the snow around us. And there, just beyond the camp, in the fresh snow, were the tracks. Huge tracks, more than 2 feet wide. The toes were broad and shaped like a bear's. But the length of the stride, how far apart each print was, suggested something much taller, much larger. I couldn't take my eyes off them. The tracks led off into the wilderness, deeper into the night. They were fresh, made only moments before we saw the creature, and as we followed them with our lights, they led us to the edge of a cliff, where the prints suddenly stopped. Nothing, no sign of the creature, no noise. We stood there for hours, searching, but the snow had swallowed up any trace of the creature. No more tracks, no more sounds. I wanted to believe it was all just a nightmare. But the evidence was there, staring us in the face. Something had been out there with us. We packed up and left the next morning. We didn't even try to finish the climb. Whatever we had encountered that night, we all knew better than to go any deeper into the mountains. Some of us never spoke of it again. The photos we had taken of the footprints were locked away, and the names of those who were on the expedition have been erased from history. No one wanted to be known as the ones who saw it, the ones who encountered the Yeti. But I know what I saw. I know what was out there, in the dark of the Himalayas. To this day, I can't shake the image of its glowing eyes, its hulking form standing just beyond the tent, staring at us in the cold silence. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. But I know one thing for sure. The Yeti is real, and it still walks the mountains. Story number 3. The Alaskan Snow Beast. It was the dead of winter when I first crossed into Alaska. I'd heard all the stories, the tall tales that locals muttered under their breath when the nights got long and the snow didn't stop falling. But I'd never really believed in them, at least, not until that night. I'd been driving through the endless stretch of Route 3, the Dalton Highway, with a convoy of truckers, heading towards Fairbanks. We were just a group of grizzled men who knew how to keep moving through the dark winter landscape. The trucks roared and groaned, tires gripping the slick roads as we pushed our rigs through the thickening snowstorm. You could barely see 100 feet in front of you. And the wind, damn, it howled like something alive. But it didn't matter to us. This was our job. The kind of job that gets under your skin and doesn't let go. There were 5 of us in total, and I was in the lead truck, the oldest rig of the bunch. My name's Ron, by the way, but most of the guys call me Old Man Ron, since I've been hauling goods up and down the stretch for nearly 20 years. Never got tired of it. Not until that night. Not until he came into my life. The thing that I can't forget. The thing I can't shake. The thing I never wanted to see. We were pushing through the snowstorm, the wipers on full blast, when I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. I figured it was just the snow, maybe a trick of the light. But it wasn't. There was something out there, something moving fast. It wasn't a bear, or a moose, or anything like that. No, this was different. I flicked on the high beams, squinting into the night. It was then that I saw it. A shadow, large and impossibly fast, darting across the road in front of me. The lights of the truck reflected off something shiny. A slick, dark figure that moved like a blur. And then, I saw what it was carrying. At first, I thought it was a giant sack, or some kind of bundle. But as it got closer, I saw the legs of a deer dangling from the thing's shoulder, lifeless, limp. The thing, whatever it was dragging it like it was nothing but a rag doll. It didn't even seem to be breaking a sweat, moving like the wind itself. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the truck was too big, too heavy, and the road was too slick to stop in time. It ran across the highway with such speed that my headlights couldn't keep up. The thing was fast, too fast. It made no sound as it moved, except for the light crunch of snow underfoot. But that was enough to send a chill up my spine, enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The radios crackled, and I heard my fellow drivers cursing, asking each other if they saw that thing too. "What the hell was that?" one of them asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse, "but I ain't stopping to find out." I didn't stop. None of us did. We kept driving, though my hands were gripping the wheel so tight that my knuckles were white. The snow continued to fall. The road blurred in a sheet of white. But when we finally stopped to check the area, to see what had happened, that's when things got even worse. We parked about a mile ahead, far enough that we thought we might be safe, and we got out of the trucks. The snow was coming down so thick now that it was almost impossible to see beyond a few feet. But we couldn't ignore it. "I'm telling you, Ron," one of the other truckers, Mike, said, his voice shaking. "I saw it too. It was huge. It was faster than anything I've ever seen. And it wasn't a man. The rest of us nodded. Even though we didn't want to believe it, we trudged through the snow, flashlights in hand, looking for any sign of what we had seen. And we found it. The thing had been fast. Yes, but it wasn't gone. Not entirely. There, in the snow, were tracks. Huge, monstrous footprints that looked like they had been made by something far larger than any bear or moose I'd ever seen. Each step was over 2 feet long, with claws embedded deep into the frozen ground. The prints led off into the trees, disappearing into the thick, white blanket of the Alaskan wilderness. Mike and another trucker, Hank, knelt down, inspecting the blood stains in the snow. It was a sickening sight. The deer's blood was still fresh, smeared across the ground where it had been dropped. "That's not a bear," Hank muttered, standing up, shaking his head. "No bear moves like that. No bear carries a deer like that. Hell, no animal could run that fast. We're talking about something else. Something big," Mike added, his voice hushed. That's when I felt it, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I looked around, feeling like I was being watched. It was a sensation I couldn't shake, and it made my heart race in a way I'd never experienced before. We stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Then we heard it, a rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily, like it had been running for miles. I turned toward the noise, my flashlight darting across the trees, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the sound of the wind, the snow, and that sick feeling in my gut. We couldn't stay there any longer. We piled back into the trucks, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. We all knew what we had seen. We all knew we had encountered something out of the ordinary, something no one could explain. The next morning, the snowstorm had cleared up, and the sky was a crisp blue. It was like nothing had ever happened. The road was empty. The only traces of our night's encounter the massive footprints and the bloodstains that had begun to freeze over. We didn't speak about it as we drove away. It was a memory we all wanted to forget, but we couldn't. The thing we saw that night, the one that ran with such speed and strength, carrying a deer over its shoulder, was real. It wasn't a figment of our imagination. It wasn't a bear, or a moose, or some wild animal. No, it was something more. Something that belongs to the ancient, frozen wilderness of Alaska, a creature as old as the land itself. The locals call it the Alaskan snow beast. And I'll tell you this much. I'll never forget the night I saw it, and I'll never be the same again.